Welcome to Bounce, playful, unfussy conversations with SoCal's art and culture stars. I'm your host, Susan Petrella, a lifelong arts and culture patron/advocate and the rockstar consultant who rockets your business to success. Each Wednesday, I'm hanging out with cool, clever, creative individuals. Today's guest is Kim Martindale, or Kim 2.
Yes, on this particular day.
On this particular day. It's so fun. So for over 4.5 decades, Kim has produced some of the country's most prestigious and successful art shows. He currently co-owns Objects of Art Shows LLC with John Morris, and they produce Objects of Art in American Indian / Tribal Santa Fe. So he's really very much connected to the tribal and Native American communities. So welcome, Kim.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell me, how did this all start? Because, I mean, do you live in Native American community or country or near?
No, but I kind of was born with some interest in it. I was born actually really close to here in Santa Ana, but 6 months later we moved back to Canada, where both of my parents are from.
Okay.
And to Regina, Saskatchewan. And
okay.
There's a museum there, a natural history museum, and my mom took care of Skylark, kind of like Girl Scouts in the US. And she would take them to this museum. There was this one diorama there that had fur traders trading with the Blackfoot Indians. And they would put my stroller in front of that, and I would just be so happy, and they would try to distract me and say, "Look at the bear!" And I was having nothing to do with it. I just wanted to be there, and in those days I could stay. They would just leave me there for hours, and I would be super happy. So that's at like 8-9 months, and then shortly after, as soon as I could walk, every stone that I found was an arrowhead, and I would share it with everybody, and people were really nice to say, "Oh yeah, that's so nice." It wasn't an arrowhead, it was just a stone with a point on it. And then by the time I was like around 5-6, then it was, I called my middle name's Ray, so for kind of Kimrarium Aquarium Museum. So my room, I labeled the Kimrarium Museum when I was 6.
Oh, that's darling.
And
okay.
so then moved from the kind of prairie province of Saskatchewan to Ontario, down to Massachusetts, and then back to California. And in California, there's actually shows that are about Native American art. So my parents were kind enough to take me down to those shows, and there were actually shops in Santa Barbara where we moved to. And so I got introduced in a much more in-depth way. And I went to a show down there when I was about 13 and started to meet these people. And I had saved up some money and wanted to buy a piece, and they said, "Yeah, here's the information." And I took the piece back, and the gentleman that was owning the booth said, "You really love this stuff." And I said, "Yeah, all my life I've loved this stuff, and I love art." And he said, "Then you're on the wrong side of the table. You should get on this side, and I'll teach you to fold rugs." And then it continued to go from there, and helped produce a show that I still produce now in Santa Fe, the Whitehawk show. And I helped produce that show when I was 16.
Oh my gosh.
And then took that and developed a show in San Francisco area with the California Academy of Sciences when I was like 21, and then did a bunch of other shows. And then I started the show, the LA Art Show, which is now at the Convention Center, and sold that 5 years ago. But I took that show from 14 exhibitors. And
nothing to do with Native American art.
Nothing to do, but art.
But
and
art.
I think that that's really the main thing that I like to share, is that this is all art, and it's really done by different cultures. And in every culture, there are great artists. And I think in the Western world, we get too caught up kind of in kind of more the Western names of great artists, and not that some of my favorite artists are like, you know, a Braque in obviously Picasso, and a Henry Moore. And we know those names, but we don't know like Chinese ink painting artists or Japanese or Vietnamese ink painting. We know it as ink painting. And if we said, "Oh, I'm opening a show on oil painting," people would be like, "Well, what are you talking about? Like, who are these artists' names?" And we don't know those artists from those cultures.
Yes.
And I feel it's similar in Native American art. And so I did the LA Art Show for 25 years and built it to a show that the last year I was involved had 130 galleries and 70,000 people attended it. And it was one of the great pleasures of my life. But it was really about sharing art. And I think that art is a really Well, I get wealth and the feeding off of art. So I think that everyone else should too. And maybe they don't, maybe they do, but I think that art is a great messenger and a great way to understand other cultures, an easier introduction to other cultures. And I think that every culture has had, or has at this point, I say has had because a lot of the art I'm most interested in is more historic art and then into contemporary. And I think that all of those cultures have had great artists. And I think that's a really fun thing to find, those masterpieces in different cultures.
How did you pull together when you were so young, like the Whitehawk show? I mean, what did you have to do as a, so.
Luckily I had a mentor who was really spearheading it, but at 16 I helped put up the tables and drew the signs because I was an artist myself.
But connecting with the artists that would show.
No, that show was it was the first show ever done in it became pre-World War II because Native American art really changes after World War II.
Okay.
The wool that's used in Navajo textiles, there's a different feel to it. It's changed at different periods throughout that, but kind of that time period of World War II really influences a different direction of art in Native culture. So this was the first ever historic or antique, it was called an Antique American Indian Art Show. Now I prefer the term historic than antique, but so it was the first show. So it was bringing together people that had collections of that material and presenting them in one place. And then that show takes place and still takes place right before Indian Market, which is probably the largest Native American gathering of artists in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I think that it's really important to see the historical background of where a contemporary artist is coming from. And not all indigenous artists come out of a tradition of just looking at their ancestral, but a lot of the well-known Jean Quick-to-See Smith, Fritz Scholder, George Morrison, their artwork, you can see an element of a historical nature and like the tribal traditions carrying through. And so I think it's really nice when one sees the historical pieces and puts them next to those contemporary pieces. Where is that history from and what is the basis of those design elements?
What was the change at World War II?
I think that it was really World War II and a lot of Native
Scarcity
Americans going
materials?
over. No, I think it's really going overseas and seeing a different type of market, a different type of culture, and then coming back and influencing your culture. And I think that a lot of, unfortunately, prior to World War II, not a lot of Native Americans were known for, it was like all of these textiles are Navajo
will talk about.
or Dene textiles. And in some cases, we know the weavers' names of these, but in pre-World War II Native American art, very few artists are recognized as the artists themselves. There's new research that's taking that back on baskets and really trying to identify baskets. On some textiles, there's Mark Winter has taken where he has a trading post in Two Gray Hills or Totolina, and he's really trying to take that back to pre-1900 so that there's a family recognition of designs and who wove those earlier pieces. But unfortunately, a lot of the earlier pieces, we do not know the individual's name, and that's a shame. But that's very much more of a Western concept too in a lot of cases. Or actually, I should take that back. In Eastern, like ink painting, we've known the names, and there's you study a ink painting by copying it, right? And in our world, sometimes we say copy is a bad thing, but that's really emulating that master, that elder, and then looking at that style. But in Native American art, except for a few artists, like Maria, which does blackware pottery, she was really recognized early in her career in France, and she was taken to Paris and different exhibitions and became well known. And so she started signing her pottery pre-World War II, but very few other artists were really recognized and signed their work pre-World War II. But in Navajo textiles, which we can talk about later, there is a way to tell something that was done pre-World War II and post-World War II, and later you guys will get that information.
All right, well, let's
You
go.
gotta stay here.
Let's go there, because Kim's brought some wonderful textiles. So let's talk about those. So I don't know where you want to start. We've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces.
Yeah, most of the
I don't know,
pieces
10
here that I
pieces.
brought that are on view here, and you'll be
Or
seeing
10,
them maybe as I'm talking through, are contemporary pieces. One of my specialties is really more historic textiles, but I really enjoy contemporary pieces as well. And what happened when the Navajos were interned in around the middle of the 1860s, and then they were released to their homelands again, which is the Navajo Nation or the Dene Nation. I interchange that word,
Okay.
Navajo and Dene. Dene is their word for themselves and what they prefer to be called. Navajo is a traditional word that they've been called for a long time, so some people recognize one, some people recognize the other. So I kind of will use them interchangeably between those two cultures. But now the Navajo or Dene Nation, they were returned to that area, and a trading post culture developed. And after that time period of 1870 to 1900 is kind of a transitional period. And so Navajos are going from weaving textiles really for the purpose of wearing them or for trading. And trade has always been an important part in almost every indigenous culture, and especially amongst the Navajo. And so what I'll show you a piece that is called a third phase chief's blanket. But chief's blanket doesn't mean only a chief wore it. It's now really a term that means a design. So I can communicate to anybody that after today, you'll know when somebody says a third phase chief's blanket, what does that mean? And there is a first phase and there's a second phase. And some people use the term fourth phase. And so back in like the 1860s or 1850s and 1870s, the Navajos would weave what are called first phase chief's blankets, and they would trade them up amongst the Plains Indians, the Ute and that, and one Navajo blanket was worth 50 buffalo hides. So as the settlers came across the country, they saw these people with this blanket on, and it had to be somebody of some importance and some status, because it was worth 50 buffalo hides, and that's not an easy thing to accumulate. So therefore, they were starting to be called chief's blankets. But it really means, and what a first phase chief's blanket is just a stripe pattern. And the thing about a blanket, a chief's blanket, is that usually in Navajo weaving, it's a vertical loom, and so it's upright in front of you instead of like a flat loom like this, and you pre-warp it. The warp is the under fiber and the weft is the top fiber. So you pre-warp it from the bottom to the top, and you have to have the entire design in your head and know exactly how it's going to work out, because you do not cut the bottom or the top if you're a really good weaver, or very seldom would you ever see that in a Navajo weaving. Whereas in Hispanic weaving and other weavings, they have a bolt of the warp that's continuing to come through. So you just weave and then you can cut it at any point. And you see the warp as a fringe, or they tuck it back under. But in a Navajo weaving, that's not the case. And because it's a vertical loom in front of you, normally you keep it kind of as narrow as possible, because your movement back and forth across. But in chief's blankets, they're one of the few textiles that's woven wider than it is vertically tall. So they're woven in a horizontal format. So first phase is stripes going across, and this piece here is a third phase, and a second phase is a striped blanket with little rectangular blocks. Third phase, you can see how there are these diamonds and triangles, and if you were wearing that and you put it around you, the pattern in the back, if you look at those two sides and you put that together, then they would meet up, so your front and your back would look exactly the same in the blanket. And some people move it to a fourth phase where those diamonds spread together and they're meeting up. So that's just, so from now on when somebody says a third phase, you'll just go, oh yeah, diamonds, triangles. second phase rectangular, and first phase just stripes.
Well, that's an interesting word, phase, though.
Yeah. So it's kind of, the first was stripes, the second was rectangular, but today all those different designs are made. And there's a piece back here that is like a first phase. I have a special mic, so I'm actually going to get up and move over here. And then I'm going to come back. But this blanket is what phase?
First phase.
Right. See
Okay.
how it's just stripes. And this is a contemporary first phase. So it was done in, contemporary for me means anything after 1960. So it's a long phase of contemporary art, but it's really hard to tell the difference in textiles. The wool stays fairly similar, but the earlier textiles, the wool actually changes in a certain time period. The sheep that they're raising changes, and that sheep is being reintroduced, the churro sheep, which has a longer fiber to it, and it has more lanolin in it, so you can actually feel it, and that's one way that you tell an earlier textile. But what I was alluding to earlier, if you were here at the beginning, you heard the question, how do you tell pre-World War II from post-World War II textiles? And there's an Oriental rug term that's called aw-brush, and it means a variation in a textile, like a coloration, that it's not so consistent. And anything pre-World War II, you will see a lot of variation in it. In that third phase cheese blanket, which is really kind of done at that end period, but if you look at those brown stripes there, the black and dark brown, you'll see some lighter brown, and it's not all consistent. And afterwards, come up and look at it even closer, and you'll see this variation in it. That is almost a sure sign of a pre-World War II Navajo textile. After World War II, coloration becomes very consistent. So, and that's a goal of it, is to stay consistent with that coloration. And there's a thing that are called lazy lines. Like I said earlier, when you were kind of weaving, that you were weaving in sections. And so if you're here and you're weaving something that's all the way over here, you would only weave this section, then you would get up and move over and weave this section, and it forms a line, and it's actually a strong point. And I think it's a misnomer when it's the term that you see in all the books called lazy line. I think we should change that term to smart line, because it gave them the ability to weave this vertical textile and weave this section, get up and then weave this section, and so you didn't have to go like, okay, I'm weaving here and I'm going all the way over here, and get a complete workout every time you did something. You could sit in a section and weave it and then move to the next section. And in post-World War II Navajo textiles, that lazy line is completely incorporated into the design of the weaving. In pre-World War II textiles, you can see them fairly clearly, and sometimes it's actually when you're just looking at it from an artistic standpoint. And there's a Southern California artist named Tony Berlant, and he coined a phrase when he wrote this book called Walk in Beauty on Navajo Textiles. He coined a phrase that Navajo textiles are really just paintings done with wool. And I couldn't stress that more, that I believe in that statement. And sometimes when you're looking at an early, 19th century textile, you'll see these lazy lines, and then this coloration that changes, that aw-brush, that color that changes, and they form a beautiful pattern in and of itself, the background of it. And that's one thing that certain collectors look for in a pre-World War II, and especially a pre-1900 textile.
What about the colors? How do they create the colors?
So colors are really interesting, because a lot of people look at these and they think, oh, Native American, natural, so all the colors would be natural. But in reality, Navajos had a very limited palette of color. They had basically the color of the sheep. So it's some variation of a tan to a brown, to a dark brown, to a black, to a white, to a gray. And then they had and this is 19th century, like at the beginning, like pre-1870. And then they had a little bit of cochineal, which is a red, which actually is a bug from Mexico that shipped all the way across. And it's really Spain's, some books say that this is Spain's greatest wealth that they found in the New World was cochineal, more than gold or silver or anything. And that cochineal dye is shipped all the way back to Europe. They dye wool with it, ship it all the way back across the country, across the ocean, and then back across the country to the Navajo Nation. And they unravel it and use that cochineal red in their textiles. So it's very limited use of it. And then there's rabbit brush, which is a little yellow, and indigo blue, pre-1880. So, but when they were released and returned in that 1870 time period that I talked about earlier, when the trading post started, all of a sudden, the Navajos got this plethora of color. And I'm actually writing an article about it and want to do a couple exhibits about it. And there's these transitional pieces and a yarn that's called Germantown yarn. And it comes from outside of Philadelphia, Germantown, Pennsylvania. And it's carded and spun and dyed, and it's 4-ply. If you take apart like a yarn, if you're a knitter or whatever, your yarn is like made up of plies. And a Germantown will be 4-ply, and a homespun is just 1-ply, right? Because they're just carding and spinning it out into one section. So this Germantown yarn is introduced in 1870, as well as these Ritz dyes. And then all of a sudden, I think, and that's for a different conversation, but I think it's the first modern art ever done in the U.S. was done by these Navajo ladies when that was the first time they had this color palette they had never seen before that in wool that they could use. Obviously, they saw it in nature. But then they get this ability to use this full color palette, and they come up with the most amazing textiles from 1870 and 1900. These dyes, most of these
I was
dyes
going to say, you've
are
got
all
like pinks and lavender and
yeah,
blue and
some of these dyes
orange.
are vegetal dyes. And there's a textile right here that I brought for that purpose. Is this textile here is actually done with all vegetal dye. And that's what a lot of people think of when you think of Navajo textiles. You think, oh, they live in the desert, they have all these plants, they're going to go get these plants and make dyes out of it. So this particular piece is from an area that's one of my favorite places in the world, Chin Lee, which is Canyon de Chelly, and Wide Ruins. And in that area, they use vegetal dyes. But they didn't start doing these textiles until the trading posts were fairly developed in about the 1920s, and they continue through that today. So in that area, Wide Ruins, Chin Lee, they're known for these banded patterns done with vegetal dyes. But in other areas, they use a synthetic dye or the color of the sheep, or Two Gray Hills, which is pretty much all natural color. And they, like that, the one up there that we talked about a little earlier on, but not in the video, off video, but it's got some Kokopelli figures, the famous flute player from Petroglyphs. And that piece is done in the Two Gray Hills area. And they're known for just the color of their sheep. And when you go to Two Gray Hills or Totolina Trading Post, that area, the ladies are the weavers. They're also the owner of the sheep herds. And they're very proud of their sheep and the diversity of the color in their sheep. And if they have like a golden fleece, it truly is worth a golden fleece because it's a very rare sheep to have. And so if you have a sheep in your herd that is of golden fleece, that's a special sheep. And there's a pride in the diversity of the herd that they have, because they're then shearing that sheep and carding it and then weaving the textile from the sheep themselves, like just the coloration, and not using any dyes. There was one weaver that for a little while dyed with a synthetic dye, a turquoise color, and it was introduced by this one weaver, and a couple other weavers did it, but very few.
Is there more value to the natural dyes than the...
It just depends on the moment and history that you're looking at. For a while, Two Gray Hills, like in the early 70s to mid 70s, Two Gray Hills were the number one textile that everyone wanted. And it was because of that natural wool. But then different time periods will create excitement in different areas. Like there's a piece here that's called a storm pattern. And they're usually done in the reds, blacks, grays, that kind of thing. But the storm pattern is a pattern that usually has some form of a square in the middle. That's kind of for the Dene or the Navajo Nation. And then you have what are like lightning bolts coming out with variations on it. This particular one has the variations with kind of an eagle feather on it. And then it has 4 squares in each corner, and those are for the 4 directions or the 4 sacred mountains. But 4 directions and 4 are very important in a lot of indigenous cultures, and it's true with Dene or Navajo culture as well.
So the naming, do certain weavers just make certain patterns?
Yeah, if you're from an area, you usually weave the style of that area. But sometimes, if like in the 70s and 2 Gray Hills are selling for a lot of money and they're selling for 3 times what you're weaving selling for, you're kind of going like, yeah, I don't live in 2 Gray Hills, but I can weave that. And so there would be weavers from outside of an area. But I think that's one thing that and that's why I like to look back on that historical perspective for contemporary artists today that are really going into whole new worlds and genres as indigenous artists today. But a lot of their base is still based on their traditional background. And because there are very consistent things that are, each group, like in pottery, there are like an Acoma is a pueblo along the Rio Grande, and there's Zia Pueblo, and there's different pueblos along, and each will have a certain parrot or a bird. Like it's an Acoma parrot, it's a Zia bird. And you can, once you've learned that, you can at a distance say, oh, that's an Acoma pot, or that's a Zia pot, or that's a San Ildefonso pot, by the design element. And so that's something that's carried on throughout that tradition. So when you're a weaver in these certain areas, you usually do kind of weave what that tradition implores you to.
But you said that some are moving away from that. So what do you see that are they creating their own designs then?
They're creating their own designs. I think really back in the early 1960s and 1970s, the Indian school in Santa Fe had a real movement away from what was called Dorothy Dunn style painting and into really just saying, you're an artist, let's see what you can do. Here's oil paint, here's all these different mediums. But I find that even with that movement away, and that's like where Fritz Scholder taught at that time, and it really transformed Native American art at that moment. But I think that even some of the biggest names like Tony Abeda, who's a great artist in Santa Fe today, an oil painter, you can still see some of his tribal identities shining through. Joan Quick-to-See Smith, who I mentioned earlier, just passed away, but she had a big show, a retrospective work in New York City about a year ago. But you can still see like her tribal origins coming through, even though they're really seen as completely contemporary pieces. But I think that that's not a negative. I think that's a real positive, that tradition's continuing on through. There's a certain strength in that, I believe.
Absolutely. So what are the weavers doing? You were talking about painting.
There's a weaver that, Melissa Cody, she's at a gallery in New York City, and she's taken that Germantown yarn that I just briefly mentioned that was shipped all the way across the country, woven in Germantown, Pennsylvania between 1870 and 1900. She's weaving with that wool today, but she's doing
the historical wool?
Yeah, not the historical wool, but the same
okay.
type of wool and the same color palette.
Okay.
And she's doing like these amazing combinations, but in some ways she's reflecting what that weaver did in 1870, the first time that they got that palette, and they did these amazing new weavings. She's kind of then broken a little bit and said, no, let me do something that's never been seen before, but it's about color combination and the vibrancy of that and boldness of pattern combinations in that. And there's an artist named Virgil Ortiz that's from the Pueblo culture, and he's really known for his pottery, and he's way out there. Like, he does S&M kind of pottery figures and that, and people are like, where did this come from? But he came from a tradition of, he's Cochiti, which is one of the Rio Grande Pueblo cultures. But in 1880, 1890, when this trading post thing was happening, the Cochiti was a Pueblo that made these figures that were making fun of, like, the cowboy and that. And there's not a lot of them, but like there's no tradition of them making a sculptural form out of pottery. Like, pottery was a utilitarian thing. But then you get tin buckets, so why make a pot that you could potentially fall off your head and drop and break when you could get a tin pot and go get water and you can drop it and it's not going to do anything? So all of a sudden you have these techniques, and they're making these really fun figures, but really out there. Like, for 1870, 1880, like they're a commentary that's way before their time. And so then he's looking back at that like about 100 years when he started this, about 120 years later, and kind of embodying that tradition, and then making these sculptures that we look at today and we go, whoa, like, that's out there. But when you really look at his tradition,
it's not really.
It's there.
Yeah, it's there. So do we see generations? And with that, we'll probably conclude, but are there generations, like, third and fourth generations weaving and?
Completely, yes. I think in all the forms, whether it's pottery, beadwork, whatever that tradition is from the area, basketry is a little bit more difficult because the basket fiber, it's harder to get. But on all of those traditions, fortunately, we have a continuation of those traditions.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. You've made
Such a
bounce.
pleasure.
Wow, you go on and on. It's fascinating. You can stay here all afternoon. A special thank you to our generous sponsor, Coastline College, its Fine Arts Department Art Gallery, David Michael Lee, Director, Curator, Professor, and he's also our wonderful producer. Thank you, David. Until
Thank
next
you.
time.